Welcome, action fans, and thanks for joining us for another edition of All 90s Action All the Time. I'm your host, Scott Murphy, and this month we're doing something a little bit different. As instead of our normal movie review podcast that we do, I have an interview with a very special guest, the author of Wild and Crazy Guys and Empire editor Nick De Semlyen, talking about his brand new book, The Last Action Heroes, which chronicles the highs, lows, feuds, and everything in between in the careers of some of the 80s and 90s biggest action stars. In the interview, I talked to Nick about the initial inspiration for the book, some of the most fun behind-the-scenes stories he uncovered during his research, and most importantly, I get his take on what was the best action decade, 80s or 90s. You'll have to tune in to the very end of the interview to see what he thinks about that. All of that and much, much more you can hear right now in my interview with Nick. Hi, Nick. Welcome to All 90s Action All the Time.
Thank you for having me on.
It's no problem at all. It's my pleasure to have you on to talk about your brand new book, The Last Action Heroes, which covers some of the biggest action heroes of the 80s and 90s. Before we dive into the book, where did your love of action movies first stem from?
I have a very vivid memory of watching Total Recall when I was too young for it, hiding behind the sofa. My brother and my older brother and his one of his friends were watching it, and I remember just peeking around and seeing Arnie's head do things that no human head should do, and just like those images were just burned into my brain at quite a young age. And then just seeing Lethal Weapon, seeing Die Hard obviously was a huge one. There was a videotape of Aliens that used to do the rounds at my school that we would just watch obsessively over and over again. So yeah, I was pretty, it was during my formative years that I kind of got hooked. And there's something about the movies, of action movies of that period, just the practical sort of bone crunching mayhem that unfolds in them that I just loved and still love. And there's something, I don't know whether it's just nostalgia, but I find I can go back to so many of those movies, and not even the 5-star classics, but even the ones that are objectively not very good and just get a lot out of them on repeated viewings. And also just the movie stars who were in them, who were often quite eccentric and really fun to write about in this book. But yeah, I just think there's something kind of safe and controlled about Hollywood these days, and that wasn't the case in the 80s and 90s. Definitely not in the action movie, where they just gave these lunatics a lot of money and they would go off and blow stuff up and record what happened. So yeah, they really endure, I think.
I would certainly agree with that. So with the book, you cover some of the biggest action stars of that era. I was kind of wondering, you've picked 8 action stars. Why did you specifically pick those ones? And was it always going to be those ones? Because, some people might be surprised that technically bigger stars like Harrison Ford, Mel Gibson, Kurt Russell are not in the book, whereas people like Chuck Norris and Dolph Lundgren who are slightly more they were big stars at the time as well, but like smaller than some of the names I've just mentioned, they are in the book. So what was that thought process?
Yeah, it was really just I tried to keep it to the actors, the stars who specialized in action and kind of devoted their lives to action, really. So while Harrison Ford and Mel Gibson did do action movies, really iconic action movies, they also did drama. And to be honest, they probably did more drama than they did action during that period. And, Harrison Ford would go off and do a Mosquito Coast, or he would do A Witness, although that's actually a decent action movie itself. But, there was something about these 8 guys who just completely devoted themselves to the cause and transformed their bodies in most of the cases. And a lot of them came out of martial arts. You know, Chuck Norris was a karate master before he started acting. Jackie Chan was, went to the Chinese School of Opera, and he was incredibly talented and kind of athletic and acrobatic before he started making movies. So most of these guys, Arnold obviously coming out of the weightlifting scene as well. So there was something about these 8 people who just threw themselves into action and almost exclusively made action. A few of them crossed over. Stallone, I think, wanted to do more drama than action, but I think he kind of kept getting pulled back to it. But yeah, there's never going to be a selection of 8 that I think would have pleased everyone. And I had that with my first book, Wild and Crazy Guys, as well, which was about the comedians of that era. And, I've had people say, why was Robin Williams not in there? Why was Charles Grodin not in there? But, you've got to kind of draw the line. So I do have my own internal logic for who I pick, but especially with these guys, there was something really lovely as well about the way that they crossed paths and interacted. And, Chuck Norris being responsible for Jean-Claude Van Damme making it in Hollywood, getting his big break, and Stallone kind of introducing Jackie Chan to Hollywood and helping him in the early 90s. So there were all these really interesting ways in which they interacted and sometimes helped each other and sometimes antagonized each other. But yeah, you could definitely, Sigourney Weaver made one of the 80s most iconic action films, but didn't devote herself to action. So she was another one who didn't quite fit in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when did the idea of the book first come around? What first inspired you to be like, yes, my next book is going to be action stars?
I think it just came out organically out of the work that I have done for Empire. And I've been at Empire almost 20 years now. And during that period, I've just gotten these amazing experiences involving a lot of these guys. I got to go to China and spend 2 days in Shanghai with Jackie Chan. That was completely bananas. And, do a really interesting sit-down interview with him where he talked about his career in a way that he doesn't do very often. I got to go to Austin, Texas and hang out with Chuck Norris for a weekend. And still the only person I've ever interviewed who's asked to pray before we started talking. And just had a really surreal experience going to this martial arts tournament where he was kind of the guest of honor. And I kind of drove in his car with him to the stadium and then sat with him and his family. And that was like a really crazy experience. And then, talking to Dolph Lundgren a few times, having a really long phone call with Steven Seagal and another one with Van Damme, and then crossing paths with Arnold quite a few times as well, and going on set of one of his films. And so all of these experiences just kind of added up. And I thought, well, I'm sitting on quite a wealth of access, and then also having connections, having interviewed people like John McTiernan, whose ranch I got to go to shortly after he came out of prison. Actually, he was under house arrest, but I got to go out to Wyoming and sort of spend some time with him and Paul Verhoeven and Rennie Harlin. So I just felt like I was in quite a good position to write this book. And I just find it an endlessly fascinating. I mean, obviously, I imagine you do as well with the name of your podcast, but it's just an endlessly fascinating period and endlessly fascinating people. So yeah, it just felt like a no-brainer that this was something I wanted to write, and it was really entertaining to put it together.
Yeah. I was, it sounds like really surreal, some of those experiences. I can only imagine. You said you had a really long phone conversation with Steven Seagal. I could only imagine. How was that? Like, because of all the planet-sized egos in the book, of all these action stars, Seagal manages pretty much to top them all, which probably, if he's got the biggest ego of any action star, we probably put him high on the list of biggest ego in the history of the world.
Yeah, it was actually quite terrifying. It was it was an intimidating thing, actually, and made more so by the fact that I got my time zones wrong. This hasn't happened very often, but it happened for this interview. I thought he was going to be calling me later in the day. I suddenly got a phone call, and I was in the Empire office, and my phone rings, and I pick it up, and I'm like, hello? And it goes, hi, it's Steven Seagal. And you're like, oh shit, I've got an hour with Steven Seagal. And I hadn't really started properly doing my questions. So I remember like calling up his IMDb page on my computer in a frantic rush and just looking at his titles, and all of his movie titles like 3 words, and they're all really interchangeable. And I was kind of like, God, I should have prepped a lot more for this. But yeah, it was an interesting conversation. He, as you allude to, has quite an ego. I think one of the questions I asked was, do you do your own stunts, or to what extent do you do your own stunts? And he said something like, I can do whatever any human can do. I can do. So he's an interesting guy. And he told me quite a crazy story about when he lived in Japan and he was in a dojo, and a white dog warned him that his dojo was on fire. And then he left the dojo and it burned down. And so there's all these kind of strange stories that you don't know quite how much truth there is to them. But that was definitely one of the more interesting interviews I did that in this kind of realm of action people.
Yeah, like I think a lot of his stories should be probably taken with a pinch of salt, because he's always, because throughout his career, he's always told stories about like working with the CIA or fighting the Yakuza or whatever. And yeah, okay.
Yeah, well, apparently Above the Law is a factual account of his early life. But it was interesting doing the book, talking to people he's worked with and getting their version and his version. And it's often like Rashomon. For example, on Under Siege, he told me that he basically came up with the Tommy Lee Jones character, and he basically wrote all that dialogue and made him, I can't remember his exact words, but made him an interesting character. And then I spoke to J.F. Lowton, the Under Siege screenwriter for the book, and that wasn't how he remembered it. It's like at all. He was saying that, Tommy Lee came up with that, and it's hard to imagine that character coming from Steven Seagal, because there's certainly nothing like that in any other Steven Seagal movie that I can think of. So, there weren't many people who would corroborate his version of events for a lot of things.
Absolutely. And, obviously, Steven Seagal is, as well as having a planet-sized ego, a controversial character. It's had many controversies. I was wondering how you managed to balance that in the book. Because obviously, it's mainly a movie book. It's mainly a celebration of these stars in these movies. But you also talk about the kind of controversies of, most of them have controversies of some sort, whether it be sexual harassment claims, whether it be from a liberal perspective, reactionary politics takes, or whatever it might be. And, how was that, managing to kind of balance that, like addressing that, but not letting it overwhelm the book, I guess?
Yeah, that was really the challenge of, as you said, it has to go in. I wanted it to be an accurate version. I didn't want it to be a hagiography of these guys. And as much as I admire a lot of their work, and certainly their work ethic and how hard they work to get to where they are, you have to acknowledge the shortcomings of them, and definitely with many of them there have been controversies. And so the attempt was to put that stuff into the book without it overwhelming it. And I think if you have chapters and chapters of it, it's going to get a bit overwhelming. But certainly with Steven Seagal, I wanted to address, he's the most controversial of them in terms of the allegations against him. In the sense of, a lot of actresses and other women have had very bad encounters with him. And I'm sure that's a big part of his career decline. But, they've all had controversies to some degree, I would say. Maybe not Jackie Chan so much, maybe not Chuck Norris so much, but that stuff was definitely part of the story. So I tried to weave it in without it becoming something that would take over the whole book. And I tried to focus on things that happened within the timeline of the book. The book ends in 93, 94. That's when I chose to kind of close it out. That you could have carried on. I could have gone right to the end of the 90s or even beyond, but I don't know. There felt like something right about that time to stop. So anything that happened after that, I didn't really get into, maybe touched on in the epilogue. But yeah, I thought it was definitely important to acknowledge that stuff had happened.
Yeah. And that's interesting about like that cutoff of like 93, 94. Why did you pick that? Is that because that you feel that that's when the kind of proper sea change happened in terms of, what you talk about at the end of the book with Last Action Hero kind of failing and Jurassic Park kind of pointing the direction of where blockbusters are going, where spectacle kind of overcomes the stars, it's yeah.
Yeah, that was definitely part of it. Partly because I wanted to end the Steven Seagal strand with him being thrown out of a plane like crashing to his death in executive decision.
Sure.
That felt like the right place to end Steven Seagal's story. And it's kind of a bit symbolic because, he's kind of being thrown out of Hollywood as well as a plane at that point. They put up with a lot. The big studios, probably more than they should have put up with from him. But that was kind of on deadly ground. It was the point where, this guy who was coasting on this aura of invincibility was suddenly struggling and flopping. And so, yeah. Anyway, but yeah, that was the Seagal part. But just in general, I thought that, as you said, Jurassic Park coming out and the CGI taking over as the spectacle rather than these guys' bodies, which had previously been the spectacle, is these guys doing real stunts and huge muscles and all of that. Which was why people just kept going back and back to see their films, and blowing buildings up. Now you don't need to blow a real building up like they did in Demolition Man, because now you can do it with CGI. So there was something about that kind of period. And then I think what was happening with what a star was as well. And I think it was Sylvester Stallone who pointed to Michael Keaton in Tim Burton's Batman and said, that's when I knew we were in trouble. Because suddenly this guy, Michael Keaton, who isn't, doesn't look jacked, doesn't look like he's been to the gym, is suddenly a hero, a summer action movie hero. And so all those things were changing. These white guys were getting older as well. And even though lots of them carried on later into the 90s and beyond and even made really good films, some of them, not that many, but, some of them made good films after the early 90s. Things did change. And I think that was what I identified as the end of that golden age. So yeah, that's why I wanted to stop there. I just thought once you've got to Demolition Man and Last Action Hero, both of which are like kind of meta deconstructions of the action movie, that felt like the right place to draw things to a close with that kind of Arnold and Sly kind of doing their own deconstruction of what they'd been doing for the last couple of decades before that.
I was wondering, of the kind of 8 stars that you focus on, do you have a personal favorite, both to write about and as a movie watcher?
There may be different ones. I've got to say, Steven Seagal. I'm talking about him a lot. I'm not a huge fan of him on the screen or his films. Even though some of the action is really good, I find him just quite in light of everything that's come out about him, he's quite a toxic human being. And so it's not hugely enjoyable for me to watch him, but I got to say it was really fun to write about him. It just felt like you've got this gift of a villain who kind of comes in, and I wasn't doing a deliberate, I'm going to get bad stuff on Steven Seagal. Genuinely, everyone I talked to, I was trying to, get stories about him being a good human being, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of that out there. Apart from Pam Grier, who, was in hospital with cancer in the early 90s, and Steven Seagal was apparently one of the few people who went and visited her. But no, he was definitely a fun one to write about. But they all kind of were in different ways. I thought that's what kind of made writing the book fun, was all these different personalities, and they're all very, very different. Arnold is almost like you're writing about a cartoon character because he's so pumped up and larger than life off screen as well as on. And then you've got Sylvester Stallone, who is kind of the opposite. He's actually quite sensitive. He's artistic. He's into painting. He's into poetry. He's reading books. He's trying to get away from action. And so they were a really interesting kind of contrast, those two. And Stallone was really fascinating to research and find out more and more about. Just a really interesting guy who alternates, I think, between being really likable and then, believing his own hype and being maybe not the best person to work with. But yeah, in terms of whose work I enjoy watching, I've really got a soft spot for Van Damme films. I just really like his persona. I like the silliness. I love Sudden Death, and Hard Target is a favorite. Yeah, I mean, Arnie films I could watch. Many, even mediocre Arnold films, like Red Heat, I could watch over and over again. I don't know. What is your favorite Arnold film?
My favorite Arnold film?
If you had to pick one.
If I had to pick one, probably Terminator 2 with Total Recall as a close second.
That's a good 1-2 punch. Yeah, that's pretty hard to beat. I'd say T2 is my favorite as well. Yeah, I mean, the Arnold is just glorious when he's at his peak and kind of in peak form and doing the one-liners. He's just unbeatable, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I mean, I like many of the people in the book, obviously, but I think like Arnold and Jackie Chan were probably my favorites growing up, and all the ones covered.
Jackie definitely. Yeah, I went to the Prince Charles Cinema in London and watched Police Story 1 to 3 back to back a few months back, and it was one of the best nights I've had for a long time. I mean, it's just and the arc of him in the book is that he is trying to get into Hollywood, but he's already made it in China at the start. But he wanted to kind of conquer the whole world. I mean, just the one thing that unifies all these guys is just their ambition, that they would not put up with being a giant success. It's like they have to be better than everyone else. And so you get these amazing jewels of ego. I wouldn't say Jackie is the most egomaniacal of them, but he's just so determined to succeed that it's kind of unbelievable.
Yeah, I think like that is the thing that kind of joins them all, like when you read the book, just the dogged determination of them all, and the kind of low points that, obviously the likes of Stallone and Van Damme, and a lot of them start from and just work their way up. I was wondering as well, you mentioned in the book that there is something kind of indefinable about like why an action star takes off, why a Van Damme takes off while, a Jeff Speakman or a Brian Bosworth just fizzles. And do you think that there is any way to find that?
I don't know. Maybe there's a volume 2 with Brian Bosworth on the cover. I don't know, but there's something. Each of these guys found a niche to themselves, and maybe it was just kind of luck that they were there at the right time at the right place. I think, I think definitely a lot of luck played its part in these guys' stories. But I don't know. You read like the Stallone stuff, or you find out what Stallone did to get where he is, and you think, well, this guy was probably going to make it just through sheer force of will, because he was probably going to just keep going and going. I don't know if the other guys had the same resilience and the same determination. But no, I think it's a combination of talent and then just something ineffable, which is just screen presence, which I think you could be really good at. You can be, the best martial artist in the world, but it might not be fun to watch you doing it on screen. But you combine that with, Van Damme's cheekiness, or, the mystique of Seagal, or, Chuck Norris's kind of karate cowboy thing. And there's something completely unique about each of them. And then Arnold, obviously, you know, there is no human being who has ever been like Arnold Schwarzenegger. And so he comes along and he's so larger than life. It's like, he just stands out in any room. Even if you didn't know who he was, you'd be looking at him probably. So, yeah, I don't know why those other guys didn't. But I think, yeah, each of these guys were doing something unique and different, and kind of reshaping the action genre in their image almost. And people were building films around them. So that's quite a rare thing. And to have so many of them kind of rising at the same time, it was like a really kind of, I think, unrepeatable like time in Hollywood history. And all these guys were doing their thing at the same time. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, and I was wondering, you know, it seems like with the book, you've timed it absolutely perfectly. I was wondering how much you knew about what Arnold and Sly were doing, you know, with them kind of back in a big way with Arnold's Netflix documentary. He's got a new show out, Fubar. Sly's got a reality show. He's got a Netflix documentary coming out later on in the year. He's had a critical TV success with the Tulsa King recently. Yeah. So you couldn't have timed it any better.
It's so funny because the same thing happened with Wild and Crazy Guys, my book about the comedy guys, because when I started writing that, I had no idea that Dan Aykroyd and Bill Murray were going to be coming back in the new Ghostbusters, and I had no idea Beverly Hills Cop 4 was suddenly going to actually get greenlit after all this time, and Coming to America 2 so was suddenly happening, and it was like, wow, okay, there's something in the water. And then this time around, like all of those things, like you said, and you forgot Minions: The Rise of Gru, which reunites Dolph Lundgren and Jean-Claude Van Damme as characters named, I believe, Svengeance, and is it John Claude? And he's
it's John Claude, yes.
John Claude, Clawed, and he's Jean-Claude Van Damme is like voicing a guy with lobster claws. So it's like, you know, talk about characters being written, you know, around the stars. But yeah, no, I honestly, the honest answer is I had no idea any of this was going to be happening. I'm very pleased. And not just, yeah, and for it to be coming out, my book came out in America, at the beginning of June, and literally the same week as the Arnold Netflix documentary came out. And there's a gigantic, book coming out next month, by Taschen, who do these incredible, I don't know if you guys get it, but these incredible coffee table books. And there's one called Arnold, which costs, I think, $1,250. And that's the cheapest version. And then it goes up from there. You can get like a special deluxe version for like, I don't know, a lot of money. So suddenly there's this kind of reappraisal of these guys. But I think there's a real fondness for them. And, you know, they're in their 70s now. They're not going to be around forever. And I think, you know, now's their kind of victory lap and people are really appreciating them. And, yeah, Fubar, you know, Arnold is still holding a gun and running around and doing one-liners somehow. And it's credible. It's like 50 years into his career.
It's crazy.
Yeah. The one-liners in Fubar are not good, by the way. I'm trying to remember, like they're not vintage ones. I would say they should have called in Stephen D'Souza to punch them up.
Punch them up.
Maybe for season 2. Yeah.
Yeah. I must admit, I've not actually watched it yet. I have watched the Arnold documentary, which I really enjoyed, but like, I've not checked out Fubar quite yet, but might check it out still. There is many. Oh, sorry.
No, sorry. I was just going to say I did enjoy the fact that Sly's Netflix documentary. Like, I feel like that competition is still there, and yes. I kind of liked how Arnold had one, and then Sly probably called his agent, and then suddenly he's got one. It's like he's got a 3-part Netflix doc coming, as you said. But yeah, I feel like they're still, even though they're buddies now, as opposed to mortal enemies. I feel like they're still kind of keeping an eye on each other and trying to outdo each other, which I like.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think they still have that very old-fashioned masculinity that's like even being friends, they'll still be hyper competitive. I'm sure they're hyper competitive in all things that they do. Talking about that rivalry, there's many great stories in the book about that rivalry, many great stories about all the stars One of my personal favorites is the one where they both have to walk into Cannes at the same time, and then they dance together until Sly realizes that Arnold's taking the lead, and that stops, which I thought was hilarious. What was your personal favorite story to uncover in the book?
Oh boy. Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, it was a real joy just talking to so many people who were, involved in that period. And the really nice thing about writing a book about, 40 years ago or 30 years ago and doing those interviews is that, these guys who were there are now kind of, retired, and they've got no reason not to tell the real story of events. So it was really funny, going and reading articles from like the set of whatever the film was, and you get the version, the sanctioned, cleaned, sanitized version before the film came out. And then you talk to the director, 30 years on, and they tell you the real reality behind it. So it was fascinating talking to Rennie Harlin. Rennie Harlin's jumped into my mind, and the story he told me about Cliffhanger, about how, Stallone was deathly afraid of heights and signed up to Cliffhanger thinking it would all be shot on the ground using green screen. I loved that. And actually arrived on the set, and then Rennie Harlin had to break it to him they were going to be shooting up the mountain, and then Rennie Harlin having to trick him into going up on the mountain, saying it was a recce. And then Rennie Harlin told me he had set up a line, like a cable, which Stallone didn't know about, which Rennie Harlin was connected to. And so he leapt off the edge of the cliff and scared the hell out of Stallone, who thought he was falling to his death, to show him and demonstrate how it was actually safe for them to do these scenes. So I really loved that story. And I really loved, I spoke to Jim Thomas, one of the co-writers of Predator, and he told me a really lovely story. He was sitting in a restaurant with Arnold having dinner, and Bruce Willis was there as well. And Die Hard had just come out, and Arnold called across the restaurant to Bruce Willis, "You know why you're never going to be an action star?" And Bruce Willis is like, "Why?" And he goes, "Toothpick arms," and pointed at his own biceps. So that was a really fun story that I hadn't heard before.
Yeah, no, that one gave me a laugh as well. I was wondering, over the course of writing the book, either in terms of like their movies or just in terms of them as a person, did your opinion change on any of the stars you're writing about?
Well, like I said, Stallone, I don't feel like I had a real bead on Stallone and his psychology when I started writing it. I'd seen the big movies and, saw him as this kind of invincible, tough guy. But it was really interesting when you start to piece it all together and get the chronology in place and work out, we had a terrible time on this film, and that's why he ended up doing that film, or he did this because of that. And you start joining the dots. It's really interesting. You see that he was really wounded by, whereas Arnold was rumbling on and just having hit after hit after hit, and he was so confident, Stallone wasn't. He was having these huge hits, but then he was also having these absolutely gigantic flops, and it really hurt him. And he started getting quite insecure. And, I just found it fascinating seeing him as much more of a human being with, vulnerabilities. And I think he was, really honest in interviews at the time, which made it really interesting to kind of piece all that stuff together. But, I came out with more of an appreciation of what a complex character Stallone is. And I think, I just, that was kind of the case with all of them, really. Because most of these guys had a really difficult childhood and fathers who were not particularly kind to them or would beat them or whatever. And I do wonder how big a part that played in these guys, pushing themselves so hard to succeed, because that's like a thing you see happening with a whole bunch of them, that they all have in common. But no, I think I kind of came out with an appreciation. Yeah, especially Chuck Norris as well. I think, he's kind of become this kind of comedy character on the internet with the Chuck Norris facts. But I think talking to people who knew him and getting stories about, what a kind of gentle guy he actually was and how different he was to his screen image. That was another interesting thing, just seeing how how different they were to what they played on screen. And I think in the case of Steven Seagal, he was trying to become the person he was playing on screen, which made him not a very nice person to cross paths with, but he kind of bought into that whole tough guy thing. Whereas, Chuck Norris was the polar opposite and was playing a part on screen, but he wasn't taking that off the set with him. So, I really kind of felt like I came away with more appreciation for all of them, really.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that kind of stood out for me in the book as well, like that kind of Chuck Norris thing because I must admit, I've not watched a lot of Chuck Norris films. I've always found him the blandest of action stars. And I've also, and this is just my personal kind of politics, his movies tend to come across very right wing and rub me up the wrong way. So to kind of see him in a kind of gentler light of, I think I've kind of seen him in a kind of obnoxious Fox News light, and to kind of see, people are complex, and it was interesting to kind of see him in a slightly more sympathetic light than I've generally placed him in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on the politics 100%. That he's very far away. His politics are very far away from where mine are. And, you watch something like Invasion USA and it is just Fox News, the movie. And it's quite hard to get around, to kind of get past that, to actually enjoy the action in a lot of his films, because they are often quite sort of xenophobic in that period. But yeah, like you said, I think people are complex, and it's actually surprising how you can react to someone's work and then actually, they're actually a decent person off screen. But he's there's not a lot of Chuck Norris films that I would choose to watch of my own volition. I would say Code of Silence, which is directed by Andrew Davis, who did Under Siege, and also did The Fugitive, is probably the Chuck Norris film that people should check out. I think that definitely stands out as being one of the better ones by far, and it's got Chuck Norris and Dennis Farina as a kind of double act, and it's well directed, and it's not like a De Niro level performance, but by Chuck Norris standards, it's pretty good.
Yeah. I think, like, from reading the book, I feel like I'm going to check that one out. I was like, I should maybe, since that seems to be the agreed upon pinnacle of Chuck Norris's work, I think I'll maybe check that one out one of these days.
Avoid the one where he fights a demon, or the one where he teams up with a dog.
Top Dog. Is that is Demon? What is that called? Hellbound or something? Or
Hellbound is the one where he goes to Israel, and it's actually kind of boring. But he does does a karate fight with a demon. So you could double bill it with End of Days in a kind of very strange 80s action movies fighting satanic forces double bill. If that's how you choose to live your life. I wouldn't recommend it. I'm not recommending it. Okay. I want to distance myself from that double bill, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I wonder if there's more movies in that subcategory, because I think there's a Dolph Lundgren movie. It's called The Minion or something, that he fights a demon or something like that, I think. I'm going to start a letterbox. I'm going to start a letterbox list straight after this. 80s action stars fighting demons. Now, just because you're on this podcast, you don't have to answer the direction of this podcast. But if you were to pit them head to head, 80s versus 90s, which would you pick as your favorite decade for action?
I feel like I don't want to cause an incident. For me, I'll preface this by saying there are a lot of 90s action movies I love. There really are.
Sure.
And there's a particular flavor to them that I love as well. I think when you get into the 90s, with all of these stars, their films start becoming a bit weirder, I think. like Hard Target is such a weird film. Yeah. And there's a certain kind of late stage, the action movie's been giant for for 10, a whole decade. And so people were just, making absolutely mad, like, Die Hard in an ice rink and things like that. So there were a lot of 90s movies I love. There's a long way of saying that I'm an 80s action guy, I got to say. Just, forgetting T2 though, which is maybe the best out of all of them. So it's a complicated question. I would instinctively say the 80s, just because I think Commando, Die Hard, Rocky IV, the prime Jackie Chan stuff. I think there's so much good stuff. But it's a very even match. It's a very even match. But yeah, that would be my initial response. Sorry, please don't hate me.
No. It's fine. I've got plenty of love for 80s action as well. It's just it's only my slight preference. So like, yeah, I love the movies from both eras. So in terms of like going forward, would you do like a volume 2 of this book, or do you have other plans? Would you stay in action or comedy realms if you were doing a third book, or are you just going to put books in the back burner for a while and focus on editing the world's biggest movie magazine?
Yeah, that's not a small thing. Let me tell you, it was quite challenging doing the two of them back to back. Almost drove me mad. Yeah, I haven't got plans for a third book, I'll be honest, at the moment. But then I didn't really have the idea to do Last Action Heroes until after Wild and Crazy Guys was published. So I don't know. I'm noodling about in the back of my mind. It's quite a painful process putting one together, as you might imagine, especially one that kind of covers such a big terrain. So it was quite painful and hard work, but it was really fun. And it's just kind of nice to have it out there now and people talking about these movies and kind of helping that conversation. And I think there's something really kind of glorious and enjoyable about going back to this period. And like I said at the beginning, these films just endure, which I guess is why you're doing your podcast. They're just so much fun to talk about. They've still got their potency. So I don't know. I don't know if there's another book about action. I kind of feel like I said what I wanted to say about these guys in this one, but yeah, like I said, maybe the Brian Bosworth, book is coming. Who knows? Who knows? I'll mull that one over.
Yeah, man. I mean, you could always do like the DTV equivalent of this book, where you focus on like Dudikoff, Dacascos, Gary Daniels,
Rough Rock. Give Rough Rock a chance to shine. Yeah, I mean, look, they would all be interesting to write about. I don't know if I have the mental fortitude to make it through all the films, but yeah, there probably is a book, and there's so much in Hollywood that is that is worth documenting and would be really fun to delve into. So who knows? I am thinking about it and kind of working out, what is the next area that I might want to like delve into. But I got to say, it will be a real challenge finding something as fun to write about as these guys and these films, because I don't think Hollywood's ever seen the excess and just the amount of money and just how pumped up everything was on every level. And that's really fun to write about and talk to people about. But yeah, it was just a wild era. And, like I said, Hollywood is now kind of, hyper controlled, and no one's, being given all that money to go off into the desert and make Rambo 3, which may be for the best. But, it was a lot of films that maybe shouldn't have been made, got made, slipped through the system. And I don't know, our lives are the better for it, I would say.
I would absolutely agree. So, I mean, obviously, I could talk action movies with you all day, but I know you're a very busy man. So we'll wrap the interview up there. But it just leaves me to say thank you very much, Nick, for coming on the podcast and talking about your book. And if you've got obviously, before we head on out, please do plug your book and tell everybody where they can find you on socials.
Thanks so much, Scott. It's been a total pleasure coming on and chatting with you. I could, like you said, we could talk about John Lithgow and Cliffhanger for at least another hour. That would be time well spent.
We did talk about when we covered Cliffhanger on the podcast. We did talk about John Lithgow a lot.
Yeah, I got to say, 90s action movies have some of my favorite villains. I know Hans Gruber gets all the love, but yeah, John Lithgow in Cliffhanger and Powers Booth in Sudden Death. Lance Henriksen in Hard Target. There's so many. I also
particularly love Tommy Lee Jones in Under Siege. Tommy Lee Jones gives one of the most insane performances of it. Like his performance there and his performance in Batman Forever are just like he has this reputation as this kind of grounded, grumpy, kind of stone-faced guy, but people should watch him in Under Siege because it's a very different Tommy Lee Jones.
Yeah, that and The Fugitive back to back. I mean, he was having a lot of fun, as much fun as Tommy Lee Jones will allow himself in the early 90s. And he does an impression of the Roadrunner in Under Siege. He says "meep meep," which is like one of my favorite things about that film. But yeah, Powers Booth, before he passed away, I got to have a chat with him for Empire, and we talked quite a lot about his character in Sudden Death, who at one point threatens to put spiders into the mouth of a small girl, which is a great action movie villain thing to do. Anyway, I'm meant to be plugging myself and saying goodbye. So, yeah, the book is out now. The Last Action Heroes. At least I hope it's out now. It's out some places. It's not out everywhere. It's out on audiobook as well. I was very fortunate to have the great Bronson Pinchot do the audiobook of it. So that's available. And yeah, I can be found on Twitter and Threads, although I haven't really started using Threads, but I'm still figuring it out. Trying to get past the fact it's named after the scariest film of all time.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Well, thanks again for coming on the show. And if you do any further work in action, I'll be happy to have you back.
Thanks so much, Scott. I'd love to come back. Thanks for having me on.
That was my guest, Nick, there, who I'd like to thank once again for coming on the show. Also, I would highly recommend you pick up his book, The Last Action Heroes, which is out now wherever you buy books in the US, Australia, and here in New Zealand. Alternatively, if you are in the UK, you can pre-order it ahead of its release on the 24th of August. Before I head on out, I just wanted to say thanks very much to everybody for listening, whether you're tuning into this on the original feed or as part of the Last of the Action Heroes podcast network. Talking of which, please do feel free to check out all the other great shows on the network, which covers such big action movie stars as Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Willis, Lundgren, Mel Gibson, Van Damme, others. There's a whole ton of stuff. If you're an action nerd like I am, there's a whole cornucopia of things for you to listen to. Anyway, that is all for this time. Until next time, though, see ya.